All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello. Welcome back. Welcome back to the lab. At long last, we return. We polled some folks in the Discord on some sort of deeper dive topics that you guys wanted a little bit more advice on than just a quick, 1 to 5 minute answer. So the one we're going to start with today, the first big topic we're going to dive into, because it kind of can branch into a few different ways, is weather effects. How do you handle them? What do you do with them? How do you keep them fun and engaging without just completely bogging down the game? But also, how do you make them interesting? And I'm not going to say that I've totally cracked the code, but I think I have some ideas that you guys might find helpful, and it might, at the very least, get you inspired to change things up for your own games. And then we're going to finish it off with a Pokemon build that I think you guys are going to like, because it's going to tie into the theme. It's all going to be connected. So let's talk about the weather. Let's talk about it. We're just going to start off nice and simple. What do you do when there is no weather effect? What if it's just a clear, sunny day outside and there's no harsh sunlight or anything? It's just neutral weather. The way I handle that is that anything that requires you to be in direct sunlight, as long as you're not in the shade, you're good. So abilities like chlorophyll, attacks like solar beam, things like that, aren't boosted, but they are available to you. If you have sunlight sensitivity, I only have that on a couple Pokemon. I try to avoid that, and that's usually reserved for things that live in the Underdark in a more traditional 5e setting. Things like the Drow or the Duergar or the Svirfneblins, things like that. They would be at a slight disadvantage. I do have the idea that we would sort of give sunlight sensitivity to ghosts. That makes sense to me. Maybe to dark types if you're feeling that way. But that gets a little complicated because a Pangoro I don't think would have a hard time being in the sunlight, but a Sableye would, So I imagine those guys have some crazy night vision stuff. So that's sort of how I would handle normal daytime. I might give a slight buff to grass, maybe fire, maybe fairy types, but nothing major, because this is going to be kind of your default weather. Nobody's messing with the weather at all, and there's nothing crazy going on. But let's start getting a little bit exciting. Let's talk about cloudy weather, right? So there's some clouds rolling in. It's not directly a storm just yet. But the prime example I can think of somebody who would benefit from this from the TOTS game would be Pontiki. So Pontiki, all of her abilities are way better the more stormy it is. And it's kind of a bummer because I haven't really given a lot of opportunities for her to shine in that weather. But this is kind of the route that I elected to go. So when it's cloudy outside, I give electric and dragon attacks an additional die of damage, and a further increase to range, and anything that requires you to be in direct sunlight is completely unavailable. So this is sort of the opposite of daytime. I put grass types at a disadvantage in here. They're not really directly affected. We're not messing with their stats or their range, but I would definitely denote for them that anything that requires you to be in direct sunlight, your abilities, your attack moves, things like that are unavailable. Anybody with sunlight sensitivity is totally fine. I could be persuaded, depending on the temperature, the season, things like that, to give ice types a slight buff. Or at the very least, they're not going to be in direct sunlight, so they might, their damage won't be affected in any way, positive or negative, but all of their stuff will be active. So we've got our electric and our dragon types being better. You're going to notice that a lot. I tend to treat dragons as though they are very, very closely tied to the weather. A lot of the abilities that they get and a lot of their attack moves seem quite related to weather effects. Things like hurricanes and tornadoes, very strong tailwinds. A lot of that does come from Rayquaza. Dragonite is very tied with storms and the weather. Just made sense to me. So when it's cloudy out there, maybe it's like a thunderstorm, but it's not quite full rain, even though I do have rules for a thunderstorm that we'll get into in a second. But let's say that cloudy day has given way and we're fully in the rain now. I give water type attacks an additional die of damage, and fire type attacks do one fewer die of damage to a minimum of 1. So if your Ember does 1d6, you're not going to do 0 damage. It's going to be fine. But if your Ember would do 2d6, you're going to do 1d6. Kind of showing off from the games that when you do a fire type attack in the rain, the damage is halved. But I don't want to shut down when the damage swing could be like on 2d6, you could do 2 or 12. I don't really want to completely hack them off at the knees, but there should be some degree of an effect. And we'll get into that in a second. I give electric type attacks an AoE of 5 feet if they would normally have a single target. So something like Thunderbolt that Pontiki would have is a single target attack. If it's raining, it now hits everything within 5 feet of that target as well. This can be a bad thing. This could hit your friends. But water and electric types love the rain. I could be persuaded to give electric attacks like a bonus to their attack rolls, but I like limiting it a little bit to just gaining the area of effect. Fire types obviously are at a disadvantage depending on how you're handling it, and if it's like really, really rainy, we might jump into the heavy rain that I've got on there. This is usually reserved for some kind of creature like a Kyogre or like a legendary that shows up and has Torrent or something. This is like beyond normal rain. This would be a monsoon type deal. I give water type attacks 2 additional dice of damage, and fire attacks still just do 1 less die of damage to a minimum of 1, because again, a lot of the times for damage, we're not doing more than 2 or 3 dice. I don't want to completely ruin them, but that is something to consider for your games, if that's something that you're looking to do. Fire type attacks in heavy rain have 1/2 their usual range. If they have melee, they can still do it, but that's where that lessened damage is going to come in from. But if you have flamethrower and it's got like a 30-foot range, it now only has 15. Visibility for anything that is not a water type is halved. So if you're not accustomed to being out in a rain or a storm, your visibility is cut in half. Because that's a fun thing to play with that doesn't get brought up a lot, at least in the TOTS game, is visibility, and how viable is it that you can actually see and hit your target. I would give flying types that are not water as well a -5 feet to their flying speeds. Again, because of that visibility issue, you can't really fly as fast. But let's talk about the other thing I mentioned earlier. When it's cloudy but maybe it's not rainy, we might get a thunderstorm. This is where my electric and dragon types are going to shine. So electric and dragon attacks gain an additional die of damage and have an additional bonus to their attack rolls equal to their proficiency bonus, if that's a thing that you're incorporating in your games. I would recommend it here, just to kind of show that there is an actual storm above them that they're not creating. They can really feed into that and play off of it. Flying types, same deal here, do have a -5 feet to their fly speed, because it's dangerous to fly in a like thunder and lightning storm. You don't want to get zapped, and that might even be a thing depending on what sort of encounter you're hoping for. Ambient thunder and lightning strikes can be really fun. They might take thunder damage if they're up high, just from the kind of sound and the shock wave. They might take lightning damage if they're actually struck by lightning. I would limit that maybe to like striking steel types. That might be an interesting setback that I'm just thinking about right now. But again, it just sort of depends what you want the weather for. If it's just ambient weather, I don't want to punish the players too much from like a mechanical HP standpoint. I don't want it to just feel like they're getting bullied, or that they can't have certain Pokemon out. It's just going to be harder for certain Pokemon to navigate in this spot, because you have to remember this is also going to be affecting the trainers. So the trainers themselves are going to get rained on if they don't have access to any kind of magical survival shelter. This is where I would tap into the exploration and survival pillar of play. This is where you reward your rangers or your outdoorsman folks, anything like that. But let's talk about, we've done the wind, we've done the rain, all kinds of stuff like that. Let's talk about snow and blizzards, because snow is a new thing from the more recent iterations of the games, so I figured I would throw this in here for you guys. It's not something I really use. Typically, I just treat it as a non-damaging blizzard. But for snow, I would say that ice types gain an additional die of damage. Visibility is halved, and anything that is not an ice type Pokemon suffers a -5 feet to all of their movement speeds. I would allow the player characters themselves to avoid this with snowshoes, things like that. There are some fun rules in the 5e Adventure Supplement of Icewind Dale. Not sponsored or anything, I'm just going to throw it out there because I thought they were neat. They have some great rules for overland travel in snow and blizzards. That's kind of where a lot of this stuff got inspired from. If you want to be real nasty to your players, if they don't have travel gear and there's a blizzard, so we're going to jump to the next one. If they don't have winter coats, snowshoes, spikes for their shoes so that they don't slide around, if they're not tethered to each other, things can get really nasty and you might start calling for constitution saves, 4 points of exhaustion, or things like that, which is going to make it even harder for them to get through this blizzard. In a blizzard, I give ice types 2 additional dice of damage on all attacks. Fire and water attacks have half their usual range. Your visibility is 10 feet for everybody. And anything that's not an ice type has a minus 10 feet to all of their movement speeds. This can put you to 0. So if you've got something that only has a 10-foot movement speed, there are a couple things out there that I've done that too. I think like Metapod and Kakuna are very, very slow, and they rely on sort of string shot pulling themselves to something. But if that's your only move speed, you're going to drop to 0. Non-ice types that aren't sort of covered in any kind of protective gear are going to suffer 1d4 damage at the start of each of their turns. I would limit this to a battle situation. But again, it just kind of depends what sort of encounter you're looking for. But let's clear up the weather a bit here, because we've done the sort of rain and the clouds and the thunderstorms and the extreme blizzards and all that. Let's talk about the inverse, the super strong sunlight. So this is somebody using Sunny Day to really concentrate the power of the sun onto themselves, their friends, and their enemies. So if we have this going, fire and fairy types, I give an additional die of damage on all attacks, because again, I wasn't really sure where to put fairy types in all of this. It's something I didn't use until about episode, I think, maybe 50 or so? I think around episode 50 of the TOTS game, we actually incorporated fairy types, because I finally got a grasp of like what I wanted to do with them. I treat them as like grass plus, without the weakness to fire. So they get a lot of sunlight benefits as well, and they get some detriments if the sun is not out. So fire and fairy types are dealing an additional die of damage. Direct sunlight effects are obviously available. Ice and water attacks deal 1 fewer die of damage to a minimum of 1, and have 1/2 their usual range. So this is to sort of keep those fire types safe. And we'll talk about overriding weather effects and stuff when we get to the end of this, but I just want to make a little footnote there for myself. That's strong sunlight. That's kind of easy. That's a sunny day from any grass type, any fire type, anything like that. Harsh sunlight. This would be something like Groudon or some kind of legendary solar effect. This would be really fun as like a layer action for a very strong fire type. Things of that nature. So fire and fairy types are doing 2 additional dice of damage on all attacks. Direct sunlight effects are available. Ice and water attacks deal 1 fewer die of damage, have half the usual range. Same deal as always. You might incorporate the opposite of these sort of blizzard effects. If you're walking out in harsh sunlight for a very long time, your players are going to start to sweat. They're going to need some water. Same deal. Another opportunity for that sort of survival aspect of play that I really like and have been trying to incorporate a little bit more, but I'm also trying not to punish the tots because it hasn't really been a thing so far. But that's something I'm definitely looking into for the future. So harsh sunlight, I might have constitution saves to not get like heat exhaustion, which again is just points of exhaustion. They might take some fire damage if they're out. I would have ice types for sure. Definitely start to not melt literally, but they would definitely take probably 1d4 damage every hour that they're out walking around or something. And you can make that a little more intense, maybe a little bit less. Again, all of this is just kind of a guideline. A lot of this stuff I've barely tested or not tested at all, but just figured I'd throw it out there for you guys. But let's talk about a sandstorm, because this is something that the tots do have access to and they have dealt with before. Sandstorm reduces the visibility for any non-ground, rock, or steel types to 5 feet. It will block out rain and sun effects, and it deals 1d4 damage to all affected creatures in the area at the start of each of their turns. So if you're in a desert and a sandstorm rolls in naturally, the affected range is the entire desert, it's going to be rough. Everything that's not ground, rock, or steel type is going to take 1d4 damage at the start of each turn. I would account this for the players as well, unless they have sort of goggles and ways to protect themselves from the sand. Electric attacks deal 1 less die of damage, and all affected creatures move at 1/2 their speed in the sandstorm. So visibility is very, very low. Be very, very easy to get separated. So I would recommend to players out there in a sandstorm, maybe tie yourselves together. Use that rope that comes in your adventurer's kit, the thing that everybody always forgets about. That's how I would do sandstorm. I would put ground, rock, and steel at an advantage. Steel mostly, you're just ignoring some of the detriments. You might still be slowed down, but you're at least not going to take that damage. But everything else is gonna. So sandstorm can be rough. Next up we have fog, and some of these I'm just kind of riffing, but a lot of them are just ripped straight from the game effects, because I wanted to make sure I covered those for you guys. But fog halves the distance that all creatures can see and reduces the range of light sources to 10 feet, because when it's very sort of damp and humid out there, it is going to compress down how far a sort of like candlelight or a fire type's flame could project light to, and even if it could, it's just going to be a wall of fog out there. So perception checks that are reliant on sight have a range of 10 feet. So if you really want something to be able to sneak up on your players, if they've been giving you a hard time with passive perception and stuff, fog's a good way to get around it, because you can't perceive something that you literally can't see. I don't have, as of now, I don't have any creatures that could see through that. You guys will have to let me know if you think that's a little bit too overpowered, but I do have a lot of effects like mist and haze that can set up this fog. I could be persuaded to give like ice and ghost types maybe a slight bonus, but right now it just didn't really make sense. But let's talk about that rare nighttime adventure. Sunlight effects are unavailable. Anything that's not a dark or ghost type has disadvantage on all perception checks that rely on sight unless they have a light source. Your visibility is halved. Any creature with dark vision ignores the disadvantage on perception checks. They're just allowed to make them. Because that is a rule that a lot of folks kind of, I don't want to say get wrong, because there's not really a wrong way to play D&D. You play it however you want, but a lot of people think that dark vision is just literally night vision goggles. It's not. It just lets you attempt a perception check at disadvantage, which is, it's not as fun to do that way. So you handle that however you want, but I would say at nighttime for sure, my dark types, my ghost types, they're going to go have a blast. They're going to be having a great time. Last but not least, on the official weather effects, we have Tailwinds. You guys have seen this a lot in the TOTS game, even if you're not super caught up. Tailwind is everywhere. I give creatures with a flying speed a plus 10 feet to their movement speed. It disperses fogs, sandstorm, mists, and similar cloud-based effects. If a creature creates a tailwind, the bonuses are only applied to their allies, and hostile creatures get a minus 10 feet to their fly speeds, because presumably you're sort of blowing in a tailwind from behind your team that is flowing towards your enemies. I allow this to disperse creature-made sandstorms. This would not work on a force of nature. If you're in a very cloudy, almost thunderstorm or rainstorm, tailwind is not going to save you. If Derby is making a sandstorm and Monty were to do tailwind, I would allow tailwind to disperse that sandstorm as long as it is up. If they're both concentrating on the same ability, if Monty drops concentration on tailwind, I would have the sandstorm return. So now that we've handled all of the weather effects, let me talk about sort of the hierarchy of how we handle sort of what gets priority. So your baseline weather is daytime. It's a sunny day, but it's not literally sunny day the move. So it's just a normal day, sun's out, no weather effect. Rain will block out the sun. This is also true of sunny day. So any kind of sun-based effect will be blocked by clouds or rain. Clouds and rain will be superseded by a blizzard. So if something is doing a blizzard and something else tries to do sunny day, you could handle it maybe as like a contested check. Be like a druid trying to do something that's a bit beyond their station. So maybe wisdom, intelligence, some kind of check like that based on who it is. I treat it as it's sort of like first in, first out. If Sunny Day's set up and somebody does Rain Dance is going to overwrite the sun because you just roll in clouds below the sunlight. That makes sense to me. Same deal for the sort of thunder, etc. Snow obviously would freeze the rain, so that will block that. It will also override sunlight effects because those ice types need some way to survive. So it's very, very easy to get rid of sunlight. Unless the creature is very, very strong and they can do Sunny Day over one of these effects, I typically will say that any effect will override sun. So it's a little bit rough for those fire types out there. All of these abilities can exist alongside a Tailwind, as we talked about before. The Tailwind only cares if the effect is made by a creature. If the effect is made by a creature, it will be dispersed for the duration of the Tailwind. Most of my Tailwind effects are concentration, so that's why I kind of handle it that way. Any of these effects, with the exception of Sunny Day, are available at nighttime, because I typically treat, depending on the Pokemon, Sunny Day usually affects the sunlight that is above you or conjures some sort of simulacra of a sun. So it kind of just depends. It sort of depends on how you're feeling in the moment, but I do have a hierarchy of sort of what will supersede other things. Same deal with fog. Fog can be present in all of these. You can really make some pretty nasty weather-based encounters for your party. If it's like foggy outside and it's nighttime and there's a thunderstorm rolling in, you're not seeing anything that's sneaking up on you. You're definitely not hearing it. And you're probably not even seeing like your friends because you've got a vision range of 10 feet even if you have a light source. So you can get pretty nasty with that. But as a little bonus for you guys, I'm also going to cover how I handle the terrain effects, because we haven't really touched on this. So terrain effects can be active at any time with any weather, because they're affecting the ground beneath your feet, not the weather all around you. So let's start with the electric terrain. Electric type Pokemon deal an additional die of damage, and any creature on the ground is cured of and becomes immune to the drowsy and the sleeping conditions. So if you would be starting to fall asleep, you've got the drowsy condition going on, maybe you are asleep, somebody sets up electric terrain, you get jolted, you're right awake. Doesn't affect anything that is hovering off the ground or flying, but if you are in contact with the ground surface and you're in the radius of whatever creature is setting up electric terrain, you're perking right up. It doesn't have any detriments to anybody, unless you are making something fall asleep and somebody else puts up an electric terrain. Then, I mean, yeah, at that point it kind of seems like you're at a detriment, but otherwise it doesn't harm anybody, it just boosts electric types, prevents sleep. Grassy terrain, all creatures on the ground regain their Constitution modifier in hit points at the start of each of their own turns to a minimum of 1. If you have a negative Constitution, you're just going to gain 1 hit point back. Grass type attacks deal an additional die of damage, and ground type attacks have a -1 to their damage rolls. This would be if Derby is hanging out with Sage in these sort of newer rules, and Derby tries to throw mud, he's going to have a harder time pulling mud from below the earth because Sage is causing so much grass to grow that he really can't get access to it. That makes sense to me. It will need some testing, and it's very, very situational. The HP regen I definitely wanted to bring back down from 2d4 because it's already very difficult to sort of challenge the players. So if you're giving everything within a radius of an Oddish 2d4 hit points at the start of the Oddish's turn, that's rough. So I kind of like it a little bit better as incidental HP gain, and the most you'll probably ever see from that is like 4, maybe 5 if they've got a 20 in Constitution. But that's grassy terrain. Misty terrain. Dragon-type attacks have a -1 to damage rolls. Creatures on the ground are cured of and become immune to all negative status conditions. So for the duration, and as long as they are in the radius of Misty terrain, you can't be burned, you can't be paralyzed, anything like that gets suppressed until Misty terrain is gone. Then if you get it again, you get it again. So it's sort of like a lot of the magical effects that clerics get in 5th edition. So if you are poisoned, anything like that, and somebody puts up like a big AoE radius thing, and it sort of suppresses the poison or disease for as long as you're in that space, same deal here. But I would allow them to be fully cured if the creature making the Misty terrain is exceptionally strong. that would be an example of allowing Misty Terrain to grow with that Pokemon, rather than it just suppressing it while you have Misty Terrain up, which could maybe buy you time to get to a Pokemon Center. If something is poisoned and you don't have an antidote, and you're out in the wilderness, you just pop something out, throw Misty Terrain up, run as fast as you can back to town. As long as Misty Terrain is up there, fine, and then at higher levels, that Misty Terrain would just fix the poison instead. Last but certainly not least, we have Psychic Terrain. I would give Psychic-type attacks an additional die of damage, and all creatures on the ground cannot take attacks of opportunity. You can take any other reaction as long as it does not deal damage. So that is mostly kind of in a way it's meant to shut down the sort of more feeble psychic types that have a lower AC, maybe lower hit points, but crazy high damage, and they're getting bogged down and they need to get out of there really quickly. Drop Psychic Terrain, they can then run away, and no creature can take an opportunity attack against you. I've gone back and forth a million times on whether or not I even like attacks of opportunity for Pokemon, because it really bogs down combat if everybody runs into the middle and then they sit where they are and they never move again. So I'm trying to work on that. So Psychic Terrain is like a test bout of that, but I genuinely think going forward in any sort of future game that I do, if it's Pokemon based, I'm cutting attacks of opportunity. I know people love them, but the only way I would allow that to happen is probably if you had something like Pursuit, because that's about the only mechanic that really makes sense. Is if you have Pursuit and somebody tries to leave, you could use that as your reaction. Most people wouldn't expect it, and that's why it does so much extra damage. But that, my friends, is how I handle weather and terrain effects. So hopefully that has been helpful to inspire you. Feel free to use any of the things we've talked about today in your own games. If you do, please let me know how they go, because I haven't tested most of this. But I wanted to throw something together for you guys. This video does go out to BT Mikey in the Discord. This was his suggestion. So if you got anything out of this video, do feel free to give him a little shout out. But I told you we were going to make a Pokemon, and I stand by that. We're going to make a Castform, because Castform loves weather. So let's talk about this little guy. So Castform has one ability, and it's Forecast. I allow Castform, because he's the only creature that I can think of right now that has Forecast. This Pokemon is considered to be the most beneficial type for the current weather and terrain effects. It is unaffected by negative effects of any weather conditions. So Castform is the best of both worlds. He is always considered to be benefiting from the weather, and if there's any downside to that weather benefit, he ignores it. I love this guy. It's great. Castform is delightful. So Forecast, super easy ability to remember, very, very useful. This would be fun if you had like a meteorologist player and they started with a Castform. We're going to talk about some things going forward here when we get into like Weather Ball and how I might scale this as they level up. So pretty average bonus to hit of +5. We'll talk about the stats in a bit. But a +5 bonus to hit, the damage and the damage type both vary. If you are in an area that has like airlock, so again, horrible example, but like if Rayquaza's fighting you and you have a Castform, and there's no weather and the weather's impossible to benefit from and you can't get anything out of it, you're going to do 1d4 normal / bludgeoning damage, however you want to break that down. If there's no weather or the weather is sunny day, you become fire type, you deal 1d10 fire damage. Weather Ball is always going to have a 15-foot range, even if you're a fire type for whatever reason in the rain. Bad example because it's impossible for Castform to do that, but your range is never going to be affected negatively by any of these things. So sunny day, we're going to have Weather Ball deal 1d10 fire damage. In rain or rain-like effects, 2d4 water damage. In a Tailwind, 1d8 flying damage. And in snow or hail, 2d4 ice damage. Your other move set is pretty limited. Castform is sort of a one-trick pony. We do a lot of stuff with Weather Ball, so I would let your players get creative. If they're in a Sandstorm, maybe they can do some ground damage. That's something I hadn't thought about until just now. If they're on a specific terrain, I would give them the benefits to it, even though Castform is floating. Castform is a hovering creature. But we have, for the other 3 moves here, I gave it Sunny Day, Rain Dance, and Hail. Each one has a 15-foot radius that centers on you and requires concentration to maintain. So that can be a little bit tough. I could be persuaded to give Castform maybe advantage on Constitution saving throws to maintain concentration. Anything like that. Just do to forecast, because that would make sense to me. And again, you're kind of a one-trick pony. You sort of only get one thing. So I would maybe, as they level up, I would condense Sunny Day, Rain Dance, and Hail into one move and have it be like weather alteration. And then you could really get some kind of interesting stuff out there. I would maybe buck tradition and consider giving Castform like Rototiller to destroy terrain if maybe it's hurting their allies. Or, you know, maybe they could set up a terrain of their choice. That would be kind of fun as well. But rules as written right now, a level 1 Castform would have Sunny Day, Rain Dance, Hail, and Weather Ball. I give Castform a 12 AC, 10 HP at base, a proficiency of 3. This is just because Castform doesn't evolve. I treat all single-stage evolution Pokemon as though you're going to encounter them semi in the mid-game, and you're going to roll their hit dice eventually. So 3 proficiency bonus, which is why we're going to see that +5 bonus to hit on Weather Ball. All of the stats are 15 because Castform is a blank slate, very adaptable, sort of a jack of all trades, master of none, but would flourish in any environment. So you're always going to be benefiting from the weather. You have no normal speed, but you do have a 30-foot hover. So if anybody does a gravity-based effect, Castform is fully locked down and stuck on the ground, which is not great, but that's also why we would maybe give them the benefits of whatever terrain they're in, maybe alter their type that way. That would be a fun way to get a fairy, psychic, electric, and grass form of Castform, which would be kind of fun. I feel like that's an area that's not really been tapped into other than like Rotom. But Castform is a tiny creature, little bitty tiny guy. But because of that, and because of Forecast, you're not going to be blown away by Tailwinds or anything like that. You are always benefiting, so even an enemy Tailwind is going to benefit you. So that's kind of what I did with Castform. You guys will have to let me know your thoughts on that, how you would do it differently. And what do you think about those fake moves? The sort of condensing of all of the weather effects. I would maybe throw Sandstorm in there too. That might get a little bit crazy. But this is mostly if somebody was starting with a Castform. If they caught one later on, I would leave it like this and kind of let them play around with it, see how they feel. But that's what we did here. That's how I handle some weather and some terrain effects. A lot of that stuff is sort of different from what you've seen in the TOTS game. Because again, most of these builds that we do are just sort of hypothetical. But let me know how you feel about that. And hopefully you guys found this video somewhat helpful. And thank you once again to BT Mikey for the suggestion. Appreciate you, my guy. And I'll catch you guys in the next lab video. Until then, take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.